There is a story most people know: Christians and Muslims, West against East. A war of religions that lasted 2 centuries and left a wound that never fully closed. It is taught in schools, repeated in newspapers, invoked in speeches. It is one of the most recognized conflicts in human history. And what actually happened was far stranger than any of it. The most powerful Muslim commander of the entire crusading era, the man who recaptured Jerusalem and humbled 3 European kings, spent more of his military career fighting other Muslims than he ever spent fighting Christians. A Shia caliphate in Cairo, threatened by his Sunni ambitions, quietly aligned with the Frankish lords of Jerusalem to slow him down. And in 1115 AD, a coalition of Muslim princes from Damascus, Aleppo, and Mardin joined forces with the Crusader states to defeat an invading Sunni army, because they feared their co-religionists more than they feared the men who held Jerusalem. The Holy War was real. The two sides were not. In 1095 AD, the year the Crusades began, 3 distinct worlds sat side by side around the eastern Mediterranean, and all 3 were in serious trouble. The Byzantine Empire, which had held the Christian East for 7 centuries, was hemorrhaging territory it could not recover. The Islamic world, once unified under a single caliphate, had shattered into rival dynasties that spent more energy fighting each other than any outside enemy. And Latin Europe, the world of popes and kings and restless knights, was tearing itself apart over a question it could not answer: who, exactly, was in charge? Begin with Byzantium, because the Crusades begin there. The empire stretched, in theory, from the Balkans to the borders of Syria. In practice, the eastern half of that territory had been dissolving for 2 decades. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppe who had converted to Sunni Islam, had been pushing west since the mid-11th century, raiding deep into Anatolia and carving off provinces the Byzantines considered the heart of their military and agricultural base. The catastrophe arrived on a single day. On the 26th of August, 1071 AD, a Byzantine army met the Seljuks at a place called Manzikert, in the mountains of eastern Anatolia. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes commanded in person. He was experienced, capable, and he had assembled one of the largest armies the empire had fielded in a generation. By evening, the army was destroyed and the emperor was a prisoner, the first time a sitting Roman emperor had been captured alive by an enemy since the 3rd century. Alp Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, released Romanos after extracting an enormous ransom. But the damage was done. What followed Manzikert was, in some ways, worse than the battle itself. Romanos returned to Constantinople to find that his political enemies had already replaced him. Civil war broke out. The Seljuks, watching the chaos from the east, did not need to conquer Anatolia by force. They simply moved in. Independent Turkish warlords followed behind the retreating Byzantine frontier, settling the high plateau that had fed Constantinople for centuries. By 1080 AD, roughly 78,000 square kilometers of Anatolia that had been Byzantine were gone. The empire had not just lost a battle. It had lost the land that supplied its soldiers and its grain. The new emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, who seized power in 1081 AD, was a man of considerable ability operating in impossible conditions. He spent the first decade of his reign fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously: the Seljuks in the east, the Normans attacking from the west across the Adriatic, nomadic Pechenegs raiding from the north across the Danube, and constant court intrigue at home. He stabilized the empire through a combination of military discipline, diplomatic maneuver, and strategic marriage alliances. But he could not recover Anatolia. The territory was gone, and gone, he knew, permanently, unless he could find outside help. Turn now to the Islamic world, because it was the fractures there that made the First Crusade possible. Its Islam in 1095 AD was not one thing. It had not been one thing for over a century. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which had once served as the spiritual and political center of the Sunni world, had been hollowed out from within. By the mid-10th century, a Shia dynasty called the Buyids had effectively taken control of Baghdad, keeping the Abbasid caliph as a religious figurehead while holding all real power themselves. The caliph issued proclamations. The Buyids held the army. In Cairo, a rival caliphate had existed since 969 AD. The Fatimids, an Ismaili Shia dynasty that claimed descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and therefore a more legitimate line to lead all Islam. The Fatimids were not a peripheral force. At their height, they controlled Egypt, most of North Africa, Sicily, and the Levantine coast, including Jerusalem itself. From Baghdad's perspective, Cairo was not a distant competitor. It was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Sunni Islam operating from the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean world. The hatred between the two caliphates was doctrinal, political, and absolute. The Seljuk Turks had resolved, at least temporarily, the problem in Baghdad. Arriving from the east in the 1050s AD, the Seljuks were Sunni converts who swept through Persia and took Baghdad in 1055 AD, expelling the Buyids and positioning themselves as the military arm of the Abbasid Caliphate. The caliph remained, the Seljuks governed. But the Seljuks then pushed too far, too fast. By the 1090s AD, the great Seljuk Empire was itself fracturing and splitting into competing principalities under rival Turkish commanders, the Seljuks of Rum and Anatolia, the Seljuks of Syria, the Seljuks of Iraq. Each one technically loyal to Baghdad, none of them cooperating. Syria and Palestine, the territories the Crusaders would march into, were in a condition of almost permanent civil war in the years before 1095 AD. The cities of Aleppo and Damascus were ruled by rival Turkish governors who regularly fought each other. Jerusalem had changed hands multiple times. The Fatimids had retaken it from the Seljuks in 1098 AD, just months before the Crusaders arrived. The idea that a unified Islamic world was waiting to repel a Christian invasion is a later invention. What was waiting was a patchwork of hostile city-states whose rulers were more concerned with each other than with any foreign force arriving from the West. Europe, the source of the Crusaders themselves, was its own particular kind of chaos. The continent in the late 11th century was not a collection of organized nations. It was a web of feudal obligations, hereditary claims, and localized power structures in which the line between political authority and private violence was, at best, blurry. A duke owed loyalty to a king, but the king's ability to enforce that loyalty depended on whether he could afford the soldiers to compel it. Land was power. Power required land, and younger sons inherited neither. The surplus of landless knights, trained for war, accustomed to violence, with no territory of their own, was one of the defining social tensions of the age. The papacy, in 1095 AD, was fighting its own battle for authority. For decades, popes and Holy Roman emperors had been locked in a dispute that went to the heart of how power was organized in the Christian West. The question was simple and deeply destabilizing. Who had the right to appoint bishops? Bishops controlled vast landholdings and commanded political loyalty across the empire. Whoever appointed them controlled the machinery of governance. Pope Gregory VII had tried to settle the matter by asserting that only the Pope could invest church officials, and had excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV for defying him. Henry had famously stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa in 1077 AD, begging forgiveness. The humiliation was temporary, and the instability was not. Into this environment in the early 1090s AD came a letter. Emperor Alexios, watching his frontier dissolve and his treasury emptying, had sent word to Pope Urban II, his fellow Christian in Rome, whatever their ecclesiastical differences, asking for military assistance against the Turks. What Alexios wanted was mercenaries, a few thousand professional soldiers ideally to shore up his eastern borders and perhaps begin the slow work of recovering Anatolia. He appealed on religious grounds because he knew a religious appeal would travel further than a political one. He could not have known what he was about to set in motion. Urban II received the letter and saw in it something Alexios had not offered and did not intend. The Byzantine emperor wanted soldiers for hire, and Urban saw the possibility of something far larger, a war under papal command directed at the recovery of Jerusalem that would simultaneously unite the fractious nobility of Europe under a single religious purpose, extend papal authority over the military forces of Latin Christendom, and potentially heal the schism between the Roman and Byzantine churches that had officially split them apart in 1054 AD. A war of religion, properly framed, could solve more than a military problem. It could reorganize the political architecture of the Christian world. He began to plan his speech. Urban II was not a man given to impulsive decisions. Born into minor French nobility around 1035 AD, trained at the great monastery of Cluny, and shaped by decades of church reform politics, he understood power the way a craftsman understands tools, as something that requires the right moment, the right grip, and the right target. When Alexios's appeal arrived in early 1095 AD, Urban recognized immediately that it was all three at once. He began touring France, meeting bishops and nobles, building the architecture of something enormous. By November, he was ready. The Council of Clermont opened on the 18th of November, 1095 AD, in the Auvergne region of central France. It was formally a church council, a meeting to address the perennial business of ecclesiastical reform, simony, clerical celibacy, lay investiture, the peace of God. Urban worked through those items methodically over 9 days. They were the furniture of the meeting. The centerpiece came on the 27th of November, when Urban walked out into an open field outside the city walls, because no building in Clermont was large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. What he said that day, we know only imperfectly. No official record of the speech survived. 5 accounts exist, all written years later, by men who had either attended or gathered their version from those who had. They differ in significant details. They agree on the essential structure. Urban spoke first of the violence tearing Europe apart, the lawlessness on the roads, the wars between Christian lords, the sword turned inward when it should face outward. He framed this not as a political complaint, but as a spiritual failure. European knights were wasting their violence on each other. There was a better use for it. He then described, in deliberately vivid terms, what was happening to Christians in the East. The churches of God in the eastern regions had been afflicted. The holy places were in the hands of those who did not know God. Jerusalem, the city glorified by the passion and resurrection of Christ, was held captive. Urban was careful in his actual letters, the ones we can verify, to speak of liberating the eastern churches broadly, not Jerusalem specifically. But his listeners heard Jerusalem. They were primed to hear it. The city had been the destination of Christian pilgrimage for centuries, and pilgrims returning from the East brought back stories that Urban's audience already knew. The offer Urban placed before the crowd was unprecedented in the history of the church. Anyone who undertook the journey to aid the Eastern Christians, he declared, and who died either on the road or in battle, would receive remission of all their sins. Not partial remission, total remission. The slate wiped clean. This was the first recorded instance of a plenary indulgence being offered for a military campaign, and it fundamentally changed the relationship between violence and salvation in medieval Christian thought. A knight who had spent his life in sin could, in one journey, settle the entire account. The crowd's response, as recorded by Robert the Monk writing a decade later, was a single, spontaneous cry. Deus vult. God wills it. Urban raised his hand for silence and told them that cry would be their battle call. Whether the response was truly spontaneous or whether Urban's speech had been precisely engineered to produce it is a question historians have argued ever since. The answer is probably both. Urban knew his audience. He had spent weeks meeting the nobility of France, taking the measure of their piety, their ambitions, their debts, their land hunger. The speech was a key cut to fit a specific lock. But what precisely was Urban's goal? Here, the history becomes genuinely complicated. In his own letters, the ones that survive, written in his own words rather than reconstructed by chroniclers, Urban consistently framed the enterprise as aid to the Eastern churches and the liberation of Christian pilgrimage routes, not the permanent military conquest of Jerusalem. He appointed Adhemar of Le Puy, a bishop, as the spiritual leader of the expedition, not a duke, not a king. He set the departure date as the 15th of August, 1096 AD, the Feast of the Assumption of Mary. The framing was deliberately religious, deliberately clerical. The papacy was to lead, and what the papacy led, the papacy controlled. Urban had a second audience in mind beyond the knights in the field at Clermont. Since 1088 AD, he had been fighting for his own legitimacy as pope. A rival claimant, the anti-pope Clement III, installed by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, still held Rome itself. Urban had governed the papacy largely from France and southern Italy, unable to safely enter his own capital. A successful holy war, launched under papal authority, prosecuted by the nobility of Latin Christendom, and concluded with the liberation of Jerusalem, would do more to settle the question of who led the Christian world than any amount of ecclesiastical debate. It would be, in the most literal sense, a demonstration of power. And the response to Urban's call exceeded anything he had prepared for. Within days of the speech, people were sewing crosses of red cloth onto their tunics, the symbol Urban had designated for those who took the vow. The cross was cut from garments and stitched on backs and shoulders. It spread outward from Clermont faster than any courier could carry the news, passed from village to village by the returning clergy who had been present. By the time Urban completed his tour of France in the spring of 1096 AD, the expedition he had envisioned as a controlled military force was in danger of becoming something else entirely. What Urban had called for was a disciplined army of knights and fighting men, departing in August 1096 AD under organized leadership. What began to move first was something he had not summoned and could not stop. Across northern France and the Rhineland, a popular preacher named Peter the Hermit, a small, barefoot man of no formal rank, had been preaching his own version of the Crusade to audiences of peasants, artisans, and minor knights with nothing to their names. He described Jerusalem with the authority of a man who had been there and seen it desecrated with his own eyes, whether or not this was true. Tens of thousands responded. They did not wait for August. Urban watched the popular movement gather momentum with something between alarm and incomprehension. These were not the soldiers he had in mind. They were hungry, poorly armed, moving with their families and their livestock through an early spring that had not yet turned the fields green. They had a destination, Jerusalem, and an enemy, the infidel. And that was roughly the extent of their military planning. They were moving east not as an army, but as a migration, and they carried with them a violence that had not been pointed carefully at a foreign enemy. It had simply been pointed. By the time Urban's carefully planned military expedition set out from France in August 1096 AD, 4 great armies under the command of Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois. The people who had already departed were nearing catastrophe. The Pope's gamble had produced 2 very different things: the crusade he had designed and the crusade that had erupted out of it. Both were now moving east, and only one of them had any realistic hope of reaching Jerusalem. The people who answered Urban's call first were not the people he had asked for. He had imagined knights, armored, mounted, provisioned, answerable to lords who were answerable to him. What gathered in the spring of 1096 AD was something far older and stranger, a mass movement of ordinary men and women who had heard the word Jerusalem and decided, with very little else by way of a plan, that they were going. The crops had been poor, the roads were dangerous, the end of the world felt near. And a man called Peter the Hermit was telling anyone who would listen that God himself was leading them east. Peter was a French priest, small and lean, who rode a donkey and wore the same rough tunic for the length of his journey. He had probably been to Jerusalem before, and whether or not his account of its desecration was precisely accurate, and his audiences believed every word of it. He moved through the villages of northern France and the Rhineland in early 1096 AD, drawing crowds that grew with every stop. People said that animals followed him on the road out of reverence. He carried a letter, he told his listeners, from heaven itself. Some of what he was teaching was Urban's message, some of it was his own. All of it worked. The peasants who joined Peter did not think of themselves as a rabble. They thought of themselves as God's poor, the meek who would, as Scripture promised, inherit the earth, or at minimum inherit Jerusalem. They sold what they had, left their fields, and joined the column. A woman strapped her children to a cart. A blacksmith left his forge cold. An old man with no fighting experience whatsoever fell in behind the procession because the alternative was to stay home and watch the world end without him. Estimates of the People's Crusade at its height range from 40,000 to as many as 100,000, an enormous, barely armed, hungry migration moving east at walking pace. The journey broke almost immediately. The column needed to eat, and it moved through a landscape that had not been warned of its arrival. When local markets refused to sell or demanded prices beyond what the pilgrims could pay, they took what they needed. Towns along the Danube, Zemun, Belgrade, Sofia, were pillaged and burned. At Zemun, a dispute over the price of a pair of shoes in the market escalated into a full assault on the town in which 4,000 Hungarians were killed. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who had asked for soldiers and been sent a catastrophe, watched the column approach Constantinople with something close to dread. He rushed food to them, got them across the Bosphorus as fast as possible, and begged them to wait for the proper armies to arrive. They did not wait. They were not built for waiting. Within weeks of arriving on the Asiatic shore, the column had split apart. French and German factions moving in different directions, raiding the countryside around Nicaea, looting villages belonging to Greek Christians as readily as Muslim ones. A German detachment captured a small Seljuk fortress called Zaragordon, held it briefly, and was besieged and destroyed when the Turks cut off the water supply. The survivors who were not killed converted to Islam to stay alive. The main body of the army, hearing rumors that Zaragordon had fallen and that Nicaea itself was ripe for plunder, decided to march immediately over the objections of every voice of caution remaining. 3 miles from their camp at Civito, the road entered a narrow wooded valley near a village called Draken. The Seljuk army of Kilij Arslan was already there, waiting in silence in the trees. The People's Crusade marched noisily into the valley, talking, praying, completely unprepared, and walked directly into a wall of arrows. Panic set in within minutes. The army collapsed into a rout. The vulnerable non-combatants and families who had made it all the way from France were tragically lost in the camp behind. The battle on the 21st of October 1096 AD was over in an afternoon. It is possible that more people died at Civito in a single day than Urban had intended to send on the entire crusade. Peter the Hermit was not there. He had gone back to Constantinople to negotiate supplies and was absent when his army was destroyed. He survived, wintered in Constantinople among the fragments of what had followed him from France, and eventually attached himself to the arriving armies of the official crusade in a lesser role. The man whose preaching had set tens of thousands in motion ended the campaign as a footnote to the enterprise he had launched. History has not been entirely sure what to make of him. His followers made the decision to move without him, but they moved as he had taught them to move, on faith without caution into a world for which nothing had prepared them. Before the column reached Anatolia, it had left a different kind of destruction behind it in Europe. In the spring of 1096 AD, as the People's Crusade moved through the Rhineland, the Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley were attacked. The reasoning, such as it was, ran as follows. The Crusade had been called against the enemies of Christ. The Jews had killed Christ. Why march thousands of miles to fight the enemy of God when the enemy of God was living in the next street? This logic was not endorsed by the church, nor by most of the nobility. The bishops of Speyer and Cologne actively protected the Jewish communities in their cities. It did not always work. In May 1096 AD, a count named Emico of Flunheim led a force through the Rhine cities with a specific program of killing and forced conversion. At Speyer, 12 Jews were murdered before the bishop intervened. At Worms, the bishop sheltered hundreds of Jews inside his palace, and then the gates were broken open. Around 800 people died at Worms. At Mainz, more than 1,000 were killed. Jewish families who could not escape and refused conversion chose to perish on their own terms rather than be taken. The Hebrew Chronicles describe the devastating final moments of these families before the end came. Those records survive because communities reconstituted themselves afterwards and made sure the memory did not disappear. Emico believed, according to a 12th century Jewish chronicle, that Jesus himself had appeared to him and promised him a crown in Jerusalem once the Jews were dealt with. He never reached Jerusalem. After his campaign of killing along the Rhine, he marched his force into Hungary, and the Hungarian king, disgusted by the violence his army had inflicted on the countryside, destroyed it. Emico turned around and went home. The apocalypse he had been promised did not come. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland had been devastated for nothing, not even from the Crusades' own terrible perspective. The People's Crusade was a catastrophe, but it was not a meaningless one. It established several things that the official crusade would have to reckon with. First, that the route through the Balkans was viable. The French contingent under Walter Sans-Avoir had moved through Hungary and into Byzantine territory without incident. Second, that Alexios could not simply direct this movement as he had hoped. The people coming from the west were following their own logic, not his. Third, and most importantly, was that the Seljuk Turks were formidably capable fighters who had now seen the caliber of the force moving towards them. Kili Arslan, having destroyed Peter's army at Civito, concluded that the western threat had been dealt with. He turned his attention back to his eastern rivals. He would not make that mistake again for long. A few thousand survivors, the remnant pulled from the castle at Civito by a Byzantine naval force, were in Constantinople when the official crusade arrived in the winter of 1096 AD. Some of them joined the proper armies and eventually reached Jerusalem. They were the only ones of the tens of thousands who had set out from France in the spring to do so. Peter the Hermit walked into the Holy City in 1099 AD. He had lasted the whole terrible length of it, from the first sermon to the end. He outlived almost everyone who had followed him and died in 1115 AD back in Europe at a monastery he had founded. A quiet end for a man who had set the world briefly on fire. The armies that assembled outside Constantinople between November 1096 AD and April 1097 AD were unlike anything the Byzantine court had seen in living memory. 4 great contingents had come by different roads, Raymond of Toulouse and the southern French from the west, Godfrey of Bouillon and his brothers from Lorraine, Bohemond of Taranto and his Norman knights from southern Italy, and a northern French force under Robert of Normandy and others. Together, including camp followers, servants, priests, pilgrims, and non-combatants, they probably numbered close to 100,000 people. They were hungry, suspicious of each other, and imperfectly in agreement about what exactly they were there to do. Emperor Alexios received them with lavish hospitality and an iron determination to get them across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible. Alexios extracted something from every leader before they crossed, an oath of fealty swearing that any former Byzantine territory they recovered would be returned to the empire. Some of the Crusade leaders gave the oath willingly. Some resisted, then relented. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman who had previously campaigned against the Byzantines and knew exactly what he was agreeing to, gave the oath with a smile that the Byzantine princess Anna Komnene, writing decades later, described as concealing calculation. The oath was made in earnest by some and as a formality by others, and the ambiguity would matter later. But for now, the armies crossed the Bosphorus and began moving southeast into Anatolia, into territory the Seljuks believed they owned. The first serious obstacle was Nicaea, the former Byzantine city now serving as the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, held by Kili Arslan, the same commander who had destroyed Peter the Hermit's army at Civito. Kili Arslan was away campaigning when the Crusaders arrived and laid siege to Nicaea in May 1097 AD. He rushed back, attacked the Crusader lines, was repulsed, and watched from a distance as the Crusaders besieged a city he could not relieve. Alexios, meanwhile, conducting his own diplomacy directly with the city's garrison, arranged for the city to surrender quietly to Byzantine forces, sparing it the sack the Crusaders had been hoping for and expecting. Now, the Crusaders woke one morning to find Byzantine banners flying over the walls and Nicaea already gone. Several of the Norman and French commanders had to be diplomatically restrained from forcing the issue. After Nicaea, the march south towards Jerusalem settled into a rhythm of exhaustion and intermittent violence. The land was hot and dry, and the supply lines from the coast were unreliable. At Dorylaeum in early July 1097 AD, Kili Arslan ambushed the vanguard of the army with a large cavalry force. Light Turkish horse archers who circled and shot and refused to close for the kind of massed battle the crusading knights were trained for. The vanguard under Bohemond held its formations under a hail of arrows for hours, taking casualties it could not replace, waiting for the main force to arrive. When Godfrey and the others came up and the full army charged, the Turks scattered. It was the first major field victory of the Crusade, and it taught the Frankish commanders something crucial. The Turkish horse archer could not be ridden down if he simply refused to stand, but he could be broken if the Crusader army held its nerve and kept its formation until the moment of decision. The march through Anatolia was grinding. The army moved through a landscape stripped bare by the retreating Turks. Wells poisoned, crops burned, villages emptied. Men died of thirst. Horses collapsed and were eaten. The column stretched for miles, and its flanks were constantly probed by Turkish riders who vanished when charged and returned when the column moved on. By the time the army reached northern Syria in the autumn of 1097 AD, it was significantly smaller than it had been at Nicaea, and it was staring at the walls of Antioch, a city of extraordinary fortification perched above a river with walls that ran for miles across the surrounding hills. The siege of Antioch lasted 8 months, from October 1097 AD to June 1098 AD, and it nearly destroyed the crusade from within before any Turkish army managed it from without. The Crusaders could not fully encircle the city. It was simply too large, so Antioch stayed partially supplied while the besiegers slowly starved outside its walls. Famine struck the camp in the winter. Chroniclers record men eating their horses, their dogs, the boiled leather of their shields, and grain scraped from dried animal dung. 1 in 5 crusaders probably died of starvation during the siege. Men deserted. Stephen of Blois, now one of the most senior commanders, quietly slipped away and went home to France. Peter the Hermit himself tried to desert and was dragged back. What broke the siege was not military genius, but betrayal and providence in roughly equal measure. Bohemond had been quietly cultivating a contact inside the city, a garrison officer named Firuz, an Armenian Christian who controlled the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz's motives are unclear. He was probably resentful of his commanders, possibly bribed, possibly genuinely sympathetic to the crusade. Whatever his reasons, on the night of the 2nd of June 1098 AD, he opened the tower to Bohemond's men. The Crusaders poured in, seized the lower city, and slaughtered the Turkish garrison. The governor, Yagi Sian, fled through a small gate and died in the hills, in falling from his horse in grief and exhaustion, unable to sit upright. His son held the citadel. And then, 2 days later, an enormous Seljuk relief army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived outside the walls. The besiegers had just become the besieged. The situation inside Antioch in June 1098 AD was close to catastrophe. The Crusaders held the lower city, but not the citadel, which Kerboga's forces could resupply and reinforce from the walls above. Kerboga surrounded the city. Food ran out again almost immediately. Men who had survived one famine began to starve inside the very city they had starved to capture. It was at this point that a peasant named Peter Bartholomew came forward and reported a vision. St. Andrew had shown him where the Holy Lance was buried, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, directly beneath the floor of the cathedral. The leaders were skeptical. Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, thought the whole thing was suspicious. But the army was desperate, and when they dug and found what appeared to be a lance head, the effect on morale was immediate and overwhelming. On the 28th of June, 1098 AD, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to meet Kerboga in open battle. They were gaunt, undersupplied, and outnumbered. They carried the Holy Lance at their head. Kerboga's army was large but politically fractured. Several of his allied commanders had already begun to doubt his leadership. And when the Crusader charge drove into the center of his line, rather than hold and destroy the starving enemy in front of them, significant portions of the Muslim force began to pull back. What started as a controlled withdrawal became a rout. Kerboga fled. His army disintegrated. The Crusaders stood on a battlefield they had no rational expectation of winning and struggled to believe what had happened. Many of them concluded that God had intervened directly. History offers no cleaner alternative explanation for the outcome, which made the defeat of a large, well-supplied army by an exhausted, starving one seem simply improbable. After Antioch, the Crusades stalled. Adhemar of Le Puy, the one man capable of mediating between the ego-driven princes, died of typhus in August 1098 AD. Bohemond announced that he was keeping Antioch for himself in violation of his oath to Alexios. Raymond of Toulouse, who had argued that the city should be returned to Byzantium, was furious and refused to leave. The crusade sat at Antioch for months while its leaders disputed territory that was not yet secure and threatened the unity of an army that had no margin for disunity. It was the rank-and-file crusaders, the knights and infantry with no stake in the political quarrel, who finally forced the issue, threatening to tear down the walls of Antioch themselves if the leaders would not move on. In January 1099 AD, the march resumed. Jerusalem in June 1099 AD was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, which had retaken it from the Seljuks only the previous year. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, and had expelled the Christian population from the city, poisoned the wells outside the walls, driven off the livestock, and cut down every tree within range, so the Crusaders could not build siege equipment. The Crusaders arrived at the walls on the 7th of June, sunburned, footsore, and without enough wood to construct the towers they needed. Genoese ships at the port of Jaffa eventually provided the timber. The towers took weeks to build under constant fire from the walls. Water was rationed. The heat was extreme. The army walked barefoot around the walls in a religious procession, singing, watched by the Fatimid garrison above. On the 15th of July, 1099 AD, Godfrey of Bouillon's men pushed a siege tower against the northern wall of Jerusalem. A drawbridge was lowered. Men crossed onto the battlements. The defenses collapsed inward. A crusader named Ludolf of Tournai was the first onto the wall. Within hours, the Frankish army was inside the city, and what followed is described in identical terms by eyewitnesses on both sides: a massacre. The Muslim population was killed or enslaved. The Jewish community, which had fought alongside the defenders, retreated to their synagogue, and the building was set on fire. The violence completely overwhelmed the city. The Crusaders who wept were weeping for joy. Godfrey of Bouillon refused to be crowned king of Jerusalem. He would not, he said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He accepted instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre and ruled for exactly 1 year before dying of illness. 3 weeks later, on the 12th of August, 1099 AD, a large Fatimid relief army under the Vizier al-Afdal arrived at Ascalon on the coast, intending to retake Jerusalem. The Crusaders surprised them before they could organize, and the Egyptians broke and fled, the vizier escaping by sea. It was the last military action of the First Crusade. Almost immediately, the majority of the crusading army, their vows fulfilled, their Jerusalem won, turned around and went home to France and Normandy and Lorraine. They left behind a few hundred knights to garrison a city of enormous religious significance that was surrounded on all sides by powers that had not yet begun to seriously respond to what had just happened. The miracle was real. So was the fragility of everything that followed it. Urban II died on the 29th of July, 1099 AD, 14 days after Jerusalem fell, and the news of the city's capture had not yet reached Rome. He never knew his crusade had succeeded. The man who had set the whole enterprise in motion, who had planned his speech in a field in Clermont, had offered the remission of sins in exchange for a march to the east, had watched the movement he created grow beyond anything he had imagined, died without learning the outcome. It is one of the quieter ironies of a story that has very few quiet moments. The 4 Crusader states that emerged from the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, are almost always described as alien intrusions. A thin Christian crust imposed on a resistant Muslim landscape. This picture is wrong in almost every important detail. The Franks, as the Crusaders were universally called by the peoples of the East, were a minority from the first day. They governed through a combination of feudal law, pragmatic accommodation, and sheer necessity. And what they built over the following century was something no popular history of the Crusades has adequately reckoned with. A genuinely plural society, imperfect and often violent, but far more complex than the Holy War narrative allows. The population they ruled was not predominantly Muslim. When the Crusaders arrived in the Levant at the end of the 11th century, the Holy Land was still at least half Christian: Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jacobite, Maronite, Coptic, and Nestorian communities whose presence in the region predated Islam by centuries. There were also Jewish communities of considerable antiquity in the cities and countryside. Muslims were concentrated in specific rural areas, particularly the plains of Galilee and the southern interior, and were probably a minority of the total population across most of the Crusader territories. The Franks did not arrive into an Islamic world. They arrived into a world of plural faiths in which Islam was one of several competing presences. The first generation of Frankish rulers recognized very quickly that they could not govern this landscape with the few hundred knights who had stayed after the First Crusade. Almost every crusader who had fulfilled his vow went home. William of Tyre, writing in the 12th century, he records that barely 300 knights and 2,000 foot soldiers remained in the entire kingdom of Jerusalem in 1100 AD. To hold a territory of this scale against enemies on multiple fronts, the Frankish lords needed the cooperation of the local population, which meant leaving local governance largely intact. Muslim villages in the countryside continued to be administered by their own elders and religious leaders. Local disputes within the Muslim community were handled according to their own customs. Local Christian communities continued to be governed by their own patriarchs and bishops. The Franks sat above this structure and extracted taxation from it. They did not, in most cases, dismantle it. The taxes the Crusaders imposed on their Muslim subjects were, by the standards of the time, modest, and were in most cases lower than the taxes those same peasants had paid under Seljuk rule. The Spanish-born Muslim traveler Ibn Jubair passed through the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1183 AD and noted with evident irritation that the Muslim peasants of Galilee appeared more prosperous and more content than those living under Islamic rule across the border. He expected to find oppressed subjects. What he found was a functioning agricultural economy whose inhabitants expected, as he recorded, justice from their Frankish landlords. He was reporting something real. The Crusader states invested heavily in roads, mills, and irrigation. The ports of Acre and Tyre became among the most commercially active in the eastern Mediterranean. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, had helped transport the Crusade to the Holy Land and had been rewarded with commercial quarters in the coastal cities. Through those quarters ran a trade that connected Europe to the products of Asia. Spices from the east, sugar from the Syrian hinterland, silk, dyes, glass. Muslim merchants traded with Frankish merchants in the market courts of Acre. Jewish moneylenders and accountants served both sides. Greek and Armenian interpreters moved between cultures as a matter of daily professional life. The Crusader states were, among other things, an economic experiment, an attempt to extract revenue from the intersection of the Christian and Islamic worlds. And for long stretches of the 12th century, it worked. The Frankish settlers themselves changed. Within a single generation, the children of Norman and French knights were speaking Arabic, eating local food, dressing in local styles, and marrying into Armenian and local Christian families. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, writing around 1124 AD, recorded the transformation with something like wonder. Men who had come from the West as Occidentals had been made, he wrote, into Orientals. They bathed, which their European contemporaries mocked. They wore silk. They kept Syrian physicians. They prayed in churches built in an architectural style that blended French Romanesque with Arab and Byzantine forms. The older Crusaders who remained identified increasingly as native, as men of Outremer, the world beyond the sea, which was their world now, and not a posting. So the evidence for this daily coexistence comes from an unlikely source. A Syrian nobleman named Usama ibn Munkidh, born in 1095 AD in the castle of Shazar on the Orontes River. The same year Urban II preached the First Crusade. Usama lived 93 years, served the Fatimids, the Zengids, and the Ayyubids, fought the Crusaders in battle, and also counted several Frankish knights among his close personal friends. His memoir, written at the end of his long life, is the most vivid account we have of how the two worlds encountered each other at the human level. He describes dining with Frankish lords who served him food cooked to his dietary requirements. He describes a Templar knight who cleared a small mosque in Jerusalem so that Usama could pray there in private. Now, he describes also the bewildering hostility of newly arrived crusaders who had not yet learned that the world they had come to was not the world they had imagined. Usama's memoir catches the distinction that defined life in Outremer, the difference between the Franks who had lived there a long time and those freshly arrived from Europe. The long-settled Franks had absorbed the customs of the East. They were, in his view, almost comprehensible. The newcomers were dangerous, not because they were enemies, but because they had arrived with Europe's categories intact, and Europe's categories did not fit. A freshly arrived crusader once rushed at Usama while he was praying in a small mosque beside the Al-Aqsa and tried to force him to face east, towards the Christian Jerusalem, rather than south toward Mecca. The Templars apologized and removed the man. They knew better. He did not. This gap between those who understood Outremer and those who had just arrived to save it was a structural tension that the Crusader states never fully resolved. The military orders, the Knights Templar, founded around 1119 AD, and the Knights Hospitaller, whose origins lay in a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem, became, over the 12th century, the permanent professional military backbone of the Crusader states. Unlike the knights who came on crusade and went home, the Templars and Hospitallers stayed. They built and garrisoned the great castles of the Levant, Crac de Chevalier in the county of Tripoli, the Templar fortress at Tortosa, the Hospitaller stronghold at Belvoir. They conducted their own diplomacy, their own banking, yes, their own intelligence networks. They were, in many respects, states within states, answerable primarily to the Pope rather than to the Crusader kings, and their relationship with the secular rulers of Jerusalem was sometimes cooperative, often competitive, and occasionally corrosive. The political structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was, by the standards of its time, unusually constitutional. The king governed alongside a high court of barons who held genuine legislative and judicial power. No major decision, war, taxation, major appointments could be made without their consent. The Assizes of Jerusalem, the kingdom's legal code, outlined these rights and responsibilities in detail. When a weak or incompetent king attempted to override the barons, the high court pushed back. This was not democracy in any modern sense. It was a feudal oligarchy, but it produced in practice a governing system that was more collectively accountable than most contemporary European monarchies, and it meant that the survival of the kingdom depended not on the quality of any single ruler, but on the resilience of its institutional structure. That structure was tested constantly by the fundamental demographic problem the Crusader states never solved. They were always too few. The Frankish population in the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its 12th century peak has been estimated at around 120,000, a minority ruling a total population of perhaps 750,000. Every substantial military engagement drained a pool of trained fighters that could not easily be replenished. Replacements came from Europe in irregular waves, mostly young men from noble families seeking land, adventure, or spiritual credit, who frequently arrived with ideas about how to deal with the Muslims that the settled Franks found counterproductive and dangerous. The kingdom needed fresh soldiers from the West. It also, repeatedly, needed those soldiers to stop treating its Muslim subjects as enemies to be converted or expelled. The Crusader states were not innocent. The legal structure that governed them was racially stratified. Franks held all positions of real authority, and native populations, even native Christians, operated in a subordinate tier. Jews remained marginalized and periodically persecuted. The violence of conquest that had brought the states into existence did not disappear. It was simply institutionalized. Muslims in the Crusader states were exempt from military service, yes, but they paid higher taxes than their Christian neighbors and had no access to the upper echelons of governance. By the standards of the 21st century, Outremer was a colonial society. By the standards of the 12th century, it was, in certain measurable respects, a more tolerant place to live than the territories surrounding it, which is a complicated thing to say and worth saying carefully. The world Fulcher of Chartres described in 1124 AD, "Men become Orientals, a new people made from the meeting of two," did not survive. It was too small, too isolated, too dependent on a stream of replenishment from a Europe that was always half distracted and never fully committed. But while it lasted, it produced something genuine. A society in which a Syrian Muslim nobleman could sit down to dinner with a Norman knight, not argue about medicine and theology and hunting and warfare, find the knight personally admirable and culturally baffling, and call him, as Usama ibn Munkid did of one particular Frankish friend, a brother. That word was not a diplomatic formality. It was what the word meant, and it tells us something about the Crusader states that neither the defenders nor the critics of the crusading enterprise had been entirely willing to acknowledge. The society that Usama observed and participated in and wrote about was already under pressure when he set down his memoirs in old age. The fragmented Islamic world that had allowed the Crusader states to exist as buffer zones between competing powers was slowly, and then suddenly, beginning to change. A new kind of Muslim political ambition was taking shape in the north, built around a different kind of ruler with a different kind of project. The Crusader states had survived because no single Muslim power had been willing or able to unite against them. That calculation was about to shift. For roughly the first 4 decades of the Crusader presence in the Levant, the Islamic world responded with something close to indifference. This is not the story most people know, but it is what happened. When Jerusalem fell in 1099 AD, Muslim chroniclers noted the event and moved on. The city mattered deeply in theology. It was the site of the Prophet's night journey and ascension. But in the immediate political calculus of the fractured Islamic world of the early 12th century, a Frankish-held Jerusalem was one problem among many, and not necessarily the most pressing. The Seljuks of Syria and Iraq were fighting each other. The Fatimids of Egypt were managing their own crises. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was a ceremonial institution. Nobody was in a position to mount a serious counteroffensive, and nobody was certain it was their particular responsibility to do so. The Crusader states survived their first generation primarily because of this absence of unified opposition. Frankish lords understood this clearly enough. The king of Jerusalem's chief strategic concern in the early 12th century was not any single Muslim power, but the possibility that any one of the rival Muslim powers might stop fighting each other long enough to cooperate against him. The rivalry between Damascus and Aleppo was, from Jerusalem's perspective, a gift, and so was the hostility between the Sunni powers of Syria and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. As long as Islam remained a geography of competing ambitions, the thin line of Frankish castles along the Levantine coast had room to breathe. The man who began to change this was not, on the surface, a natural candidate for holy war. Imad ad-Din Zengi was the Turkic Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, a military governor of enormous ambition and considerable brutality, described by chroniclers on both sides as a man of fierce temper, who was equally capable of executing a subordinate for insubordination and forging a pragmatic alliance with a Crusader lord if it served his immediate interests. He spent more of his career fighting other Muslim rulers than fighting the Franks. He made truces with the Kingdom of Jerusalem when it suited him. He was not, by any honest measure, a pious man or a principled jihadist. What he was a supremely effective consolidator of power. When Zengi besieged and captured the city of Edessa on Christmas Eve, 1144 AD, the first major Crusader state to fall, the Muslim world celebrated with something approaching disbelief. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad named him the Sword of the Faithful. Poets composed panegyrics. The event was described as a victory of victories. For 45 years, the Frankish states had seemed immovable. Zengi had just proved they were not. He had done it, characteristically, for primarily political reasons. Jocelyn II of Edessa had made an alliance with Zengi's Muslim rivals and had marched his army east to assist them, leaving the city exposed. Zengi saw an opportunity and took it. The rhetoric of jihad followed the victory rather than preceding it. But the rhetoric mattered. It gave the capture of Edessa a meaning that transcended Zengi's particular ambitions. Zengi was assassinated in 1146 AD by a Frankish slave during a siege, stabbed while drunk. His son Nur ad-Din inherited Aleppo, and in him the jihad rhetoric ceased to be rhetoric. Nur ad-Din was genuinely and deeply pious, a ruler who refused the trappings of personal luxury, built madrasas and hospitals across his territories, and framed the struggle against the Crusaders as the central purpose of his reign in terms that were ideologically coherent rather than politically convenient. He established what might be called the first sustained counter-crusade ideology, a systematic argument promoted through religious institutions and public discourse, showed that Muslim unity against the Franks was both a political necessity and a religious obligation. He had the pulpits of his mosques preach it. He had scholars write about it. He had a special pulpit, a minbar, constructed in anticipation of the day it would be placed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in a liberated Jerusalem. He never lived to see it placed there. Nur ad-Din's great strategic achievement was the annexation of Damascus in 1154 AD. Damascus had long been a Crusader ally of convenience. The rulers of Damascus found the Kingdom of Jerusalem a more tolerable neighbor than an expansionist Zengi or Nur ad-Din to their north. When Nur ad-Din took Damascus peacefully, through diplomatic pressure and the exhaustion of its governing class, the strategic geography of the Crusader states changed permanently. Jerusalem was now flanked on the north by Nur ad-Din's Aleppo, and on the east by his Damascus. The encirclement that would eventually destroy the Crusader states had begun. Nur ad-Din also understood that to complete the encirclement, he needed Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate was weakening from within, and whoever controlled Egypt controlled the richest agricultural base in the region and the most direct route for additional crusading armies from Europe. The struggle for Egypt in the 1160s AD was one of the stranger episodes of the entire crusading era. The Fatimid Caliphate, dying from internal decay and faction warfare, found itself simultaneously courted and threatened by both Nur ad-Din and King Amalric I of Jerusalem, each trying to turn the decaying Egyptian state into a client or a conquest. The Fatimid viziers played the two sides against each other with fading skill. In 1164 AD, Nur ad-Din sent his general Shirkuh and Shirkuh's young nephew, a quiet Kurdish officer named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known by his title Salah ad-Din, into Egypt to install a friendly vizier. The Crusaders sent their own force to counter them. What followed was 3 years of military maneuvering in the Nile Delta, with the Fatimids, the Crusaders, and Nur ad-Din's forces all struggling for position in a country none of them fully controlled. Shirkuh died in 1169 AD, and Saladin, now 31 years old, was appointed vizier of Egypt in his place. His appointment was formally made by the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid, the last and most powerless of his dynasty. Within 2 years, Al-Adid was dead, and Saladin had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate entirely, realigning Egypt with the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and beginning the systematic dismantling of Fatimid institutions. The mosque sermons that had praised the Shia Caliphate for 2 centuries now praised the Sunni one. The ideological rupture was enormous. For the purposes of the crusading era's geopolitics, the consequence was this. The single greatest source of Islamic fragmentation, the Sunni-Shia institutional divide that had kept Cairo and Baghdad as permanent enemies, was ended. Saladin controlled Egypt. Nur ad-Din controlled Syria. The Franks were now surrounded. Nur ad-Din died in 1174 AD, leaving an 11-year-old son and a power vacuum that Saladin moved to fill with remarkable speed. He marched from Egypt into Syria with 700 cavalry, entered Damascus without resistance, then, over the following decade, fought his way through the remaining Zengid territories, Hama, Homs, Aleppo, finally Mosul, bringing the entirety of the Muslim Levant and Egypt under his single command. It is worth noting how he did it. Saladin spent more years and more military effort fighting other Muslim rulers than he ever spent fighting the Crusader states. When his opponents argued that he was betraying the Jihad by warring against fellow Muslims, he answered that only unity could produce victory, and unity required first that he be its center. He was not wrong about the logic. He was extremely good at making that logic work for him. Saladin was a Kurd, not a Turk or an Arab, and his rise to power over predominantly Turkish and Arab territories required constant ideological work to legitimate. He cultivated religious scholars who praised him as the restorer of Sunni orthodoxy. He married a widow of Nur ad-Din to claim dynastic continuity. He commissioned letters and proclamations from his court secretary al-Qadi al-Fadil that positioned every military move as an act of service to Islam. He built madrasas and mosques. He was genuinely devout by every account we have. His court biographer records that he prayed on time, was moved to tears by Quranic recitation, and hated the philosophers who doubted God's attributes. He was also a shrewd and patient statesman who understood that piety and power were not opposites. He had watched Nur ad-Din use religious authority as political capital for 20 years. He had learned from a master. By the mid-1180s AD, Nur Saladin had achieved what no Muslim ruler had managed since the First Crusade: a single authority controlling Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and the Hejaz. The Crusader states, which had survived for nearly a century by exploiting the divisions between these powers, now found themselves encircled by a single empire that shared a border with them on every side except the sea. The Frankish military resources had not grown. The Muslim resources available to Saladin were vastly greater than anything any previous Muslim ruler had been able to assemble. The question of whether the Crusader states would survive was now primarily a question of whether they could avoid a catastrophic military defeat before fresh reinforcements from Europe arrived. What they needed, most urgently, was for their own leadership to maintain discipline and restraint. What they got instead was Reginald of Châtillon. Reginald of Châtillon was a French nobleman who had arrived in Outremer during the Second Crusade and had spent decades accumulating enemies on both sides of the religious divide with equal thoroughness. He had been imprisoned by the Muslims for 16 years for an attack on Byzantium. He had raided Muslim pilgrimage caravans in violation of standing truces. In 1187 AD, he attacked a large Muslim caravan, reportedly including members of Saladin's own family, while a formal truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was in force. The attack was in direct defiance of the king's orders. Saladin responded by declaring war and gathering his full strength. The king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, he gathered every knight and foot soldier the kingdom could field. On the 4th of July, 1187 AD, the two armies met on a waterless plateau above the Sea of Galilee at a place called the Horns of Hattin. The Battle of Hattin was over by afternoon. The Crusader army, drawn across waterless ground without adequate supply, encircled by Saladin's cavalry, cut off from the lake below, and fighting in clouds of smoke from grass fires set by Saladin's archers, collapsed in stages and was virtually annihilated. The king of Jerusalem was captured. Reginald of Châtillon was brought before Saladin, who offered Guy of Lusignan water in a gesture of mercy, and then refused to extend the same offer to Reginald, whom he executed personally for the caravan attack. The military orders, the Templars, and Hospitallers were killed almost to a man. To the Frankish field army, the entire professional military force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Jerusalem, stripped of its defenders, surrendered to Saladin on the 2nd of October 1187 AD, exactly 88 years after the Crusaders had taken it. The Second Crusade was the first time that reigning European kings led a crusade in person, and it ended in a disaster so complete and so inexplicable that chroniclers on both sides struggled to account for it without implying that God had been absent. Pope Eugenius III called it in 1145 AD in response to the fall of Edessa. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most respected preacher in Europe, it's a man whose words could silence a room and move a crowd to tears, toured France and the Rhineland, preaching it with a fervor that made Urban II's original call seem modest by comparison. Two kings took the cross, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. The response across Europe was enormous. What arrived in the Holy Land was considerably less than what had set out. Conrad's army left Germany in May 1147 AD, numbering perhaps 20,000 soldiers. By the time it reached Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks had been watching for it and were ready. In October 1147 AD, at the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, the same plain where the First Crusade had won a decisive victory 50 years before, Conrad's force was ambushed and virtually destroyed. He arrived in Jerusalem months later with perhaps a few thousand men. Louis's army fared scarcely better, and suffering its own ambushes in the mountain passes of Anatolia and arriving in the Holy Land severely reduced. Two of the most powerful monarchs in Western Christendom, leading armies that had set out with such confidence, had been ground down to remnants before they saw a single crusader state. What happened next compounded the disaster in ways the settled crusaders of Outremer never fully forgave. The kings and their commanders assembled at Acre in June 1148 AD to decide what to attack. The obvious target was Edessa. It was, after all, the city whose loss had triggered the whole expedition. The problem was that Edessa was now extremely well defended. Nur ad-Din had reinforced it after Zengi's capture, then demolished its walls entirely after briefly losing it back to the Franks, making it impossible to hold even if retaken. The council, thus casting about for an alternative, settled on Damascus. Damascus was the most important Muslim city in southern Syria. It was also, at that moment, a de facto ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The rulers of Damascus had maintained a careful neutrality, preferring the Franks as a tolerable neighbor over Nur ad-Din's expanding empire. The decision to attack Damascus is one of the stranger episodes in crusading history, and historians have argued about it ever since. The best explanation is that the Crusader barons of Outremer understood that Damascus would eventually fall to Nur ad-Din and wanted to take it first. The worst explanation is greed. Local gossip recorded that certain Frankish nobles were bribed by Nur ad-Din to deliberately botch the operation. Whatever the cause, the siege lasted 4 days. The Crusaders initially occupied the orchards west of the city, which provided shade, water, and food. Then, inexplicably, they abandoned that position and moved to the exposed eastern walls, where there was nothing: no water, no cover, no food, and where they were told Nur ad-Din's relief army was approaching. Within days, the Crusaders retreated entirely. Louis and Conrad sailed home. Damascus, now diplomatically convinced that the Franks were its mortal enemy, fell to Nur ad-Din 6 years later with barely any resistance. The failure of the Second Crusade produced a specific kind of damage that went beyond military setback. For 4 decades after 1149 AD, European enthusiasm for large-scale crusading essentially collapsed. Minor expeditions continued. Individual knights traveled to Outremer to fulfill religious vows or seek land. But the mobilization of sovereign armies under papal authority with the full ceremonial weight of indulgence and cross-taking, did not happen again for a generation. The Crusader states, stripped of the expectation of major reinforcement, learned to manage their precarious position through diplomacy, truces, and the careful exploitation of Muslim divisions. They survived, barely, on the same logic that had served them from the beginning. Their enemies were still more afraid of each other than of them. Hattin ended that. News of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem reached Europe in the autumn of 1187 AD and produced a response unlike anything since Urban II's sermon at Clermont. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call to crusade immediately. 3 of the most powerful monarchs in the world answered: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, in Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, known even in his own lifetime as the Lionheart. Frederick left first, commanding a force that contemporary sources estimated at 100,000, almost certainly an exaggeration, but unquestionably enormous. He drowned crossing the Salef River in Anatolia in June 1190 AD. The cause of death was probably a heart attack induced by attempting to swim his horse through a fast current. Most of his army, desolated and leaderless, turned around and went home. The greatest land force assembled for the Third Crusade never arrived. Philip and Richard reached Acre in 1191 AD after a series of delays, political crises, and the kind of logistical nightmare that characterized every major crusade. And Acre had been under siege by the remnant Crusader forces since 1189 AD, a 2-year investment in which the besiegers were themselves besieged by Saladin's army on the landward side, producing a strange triple standoff in which the Crusaders in the camp were slowly dying of disease even as they maintained their siege lines. Richard's arrival in June 1191 AD transformed the situation within weeks. Acre fell on the 12th of July, 1191 AD. Philip, believing his crusading vow fulfilled, departed for France almost immediately, leaving Richard as the sole commanding force of the crusade. Richard was a military commander of extraordinary quality. He understood supply, morale, formation discipline, and the psychology of the particular enemy he was fighting in a way that almost none of his predecessors had. He marched his army south from Acre along the coast in tight formation, cavalry on the inland side, infantry between them and the sea, maintaining order under constant harassment from Saladin's archers through discipline and rotation rather than counterattack. At Arsuf, on the 7th of September 1191 AD, when the Hospitallers on the rearguard finally broke under sustained arrow fire and charged without orders, Richard turned a potential disaster into a rout by committing his own cavalry immediately, catching Saladin's force disorganized. He won, and then, characteristically, he stopped and assessed rather than pursuing. Richard advanced on Jerusalem twice. Both times he came within sight of the walls, and both times he turned back, not from cowardice, but from strategic reasoning that his own army found almost impossible to accept. He understood that taking Jerusalem was achievable. Holding it without controlling the surrounding countryside was not. His supply lines ran from the coast, and once his army moved inland, the Ayyubids could sever them. He had watched what happened when Crusader armies lost their supply lines. He was not going to do it again. The men who had marched from Europe with the specific intention of praying in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stood 12 miles from the city and watched their commander make the correct decision and hated him for it. The negotiations that followed were, in their way, more remarkable than any of the battles. Richard and Saladin never met in person, but they conducted a lengthy correspondence through intermediaries that contained some of the more extraordinary diplomatic exchanges of the medieval world. They argued about the justice of their respective causes, about the nature of Jerusalem's significance, about the terms on which a settlement might work. Richard proposed at one point that his sister Joan marry Saladin's brother Al-Adil, who would then rule Jerusalem as a joint Christian-Muslim kingdom. an idea so outside the categories of both cultures that it was rejected without being seriously considered. What they eventually settled on was simpler and, in its way, more durable. On the 2nd of September 1192 AD, Richard and Saladin concluded the Treaty of Jaffa. Under its terms, Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa remained in Christian hands. Christian pilgrims, unarmed, were guaranteed safe passage to visit the holy sites of Jerusalem. The fortress of Ascalon, which Richard had painstakingly rebuilt from ruins, was demolished and returned to Saladin as a condition. Neither side was satisfied. Many in Europe felt Richard had failed by not recovering the city. Many in the Islamic world felt Saladin had betrayed the principles of Jihad by making a deal that left the Franks with a territorial foothold at all. Both reactions missed the essential nature of what had happened. The Treaty of Jaffa was not a military outcome. It was a negotiated settlement between two powers that had exhausted each other and had more pressing concerns at home. Richard's England was being destabilized by his brother John and his rival Philip of France. Saladin's empire was economically strained and facing challenges to its internal coherence. And the crusade had begun with the explicit goal of recovering the city where Christ had died and risen. It ended with a legal arrangement that gave pilgrims the right to walk to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre without a sword at their side. Saladin had kept Jerusalem. Richard had kept the Pilgrim's Road. Both men were back home within months. Saladin died in Damascus on the 4th of March, 1193 AD, 7 months after the treaty was signed. He had given away almost everything he owned in charity and left so little in his treasury that the cost of his funeral was borrowed. The Third Crusade did something the first two had not. It established a precedent for treating the crusading enterprise as a political negotiation rather than a religious absolute. Urban II had offered the remission of sins in exchange for fighting. Now Richard's treaty offered Christians access to their holiest city without fighting at all. It was, from one angle, a capitulation. From another, it was the most honest reckoning yet with what the Crusades were actually about and what they were actually capable of achieving. The pilgrims who walked into Jerusalem the following spring under the terms of the treaty came in peace and found the city intact. It is not how anyone had imagined the crusade would end. It is also, by almost any measure, the best outcome it produced. Richard left the Holy Land on the 9th of October, 1192 AD. On the voyage home, his ship was blown off course, and he was captured by the Duke of Austria, a man he had publicly humiliated at Acre by having his banner thrown from the walls. He spent 14 months in captivity. He ransomed for 150,000 marks of silver, a sum equivalent to 3 times the annual revenue of England. His kingdom paid it. The crusade had taken him away for 3 years, cost his country an extraordinary ransom, and produced a negotiated treaty that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands. He was celebrated as the greatest warrior king in Christendom. The balance between what he had accomplished and how it was received tells us something essential about what crusading meant and what it was capable of meaning by the end of the 12th century. By the opening of the 13th century, the crusading instrument had proven something its creators had not fully anticipated. It could be aimed at anything. Urban II had constructed it as a mechanism for redirecting European violence toward a specific enemy, the Muslims of the Holy Land, and for consolidating papal authority over the nobility of Latin Christendom in the process. What became clear over the following 100 years was that once you had established the principle that the Pope could offer the remission of sins for fighting in a holy war, you could not easily contain who got to decide what counted as holy and who counted as the enemy. Pope Innocent III, who came to office in 1198 AD, was the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages. Brilliant, imperious, and possessed of a vision of papal authority so expansive that it left almost no human activity outside the Church's jurisdiction. He launched the Fourth Crusade in 1198 AD with the explicit intention of recovering Jerusalem by first conquering Egypt, the economic base of Saladin's successors. It was a reasonable strategic idea. What happened instead was one of the defining catastrophes of the medieval world, and Innocent spent the rest of his papacy trying to explain that it was not his fault. The problem began in Venice. The Crusade leaders had contracted with the Republic of Venice to transport 33,500 men to Egypt by sea, at an agreed price of 85,000 silver marks. When the Crusaders gathered in Venice in 1202 AD, they discovered that far fewer men had shown up than expected. Many had sailed from other ports or simply never came. The army that assembled could pay perhaps half the contracted sum. This Venice had spent a year building the fleet and could not absorb the loss. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, a man over 90 years old, completely blind, sharp as any man in the room, proposed a solution. The Crusaders would cancel their debt by helping Venice recapture the Adriatic city of Zara, which had rebelled against Venetian control and placed itself under the protection of Hungary. Hungary's king was himself a crusader. Zara was a Catholic city. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade the attack. The Crusaders went anyway. Innocent excommunicated the entire army, then lifted the sentence on the French contingent when they sent envoys explaining the desperate circumstances. The Venetians never sent envoys and remained excommunicated. The crusade pressed on, an excommunicated army, nominally fighting under the sign of the cross, and now morally incoherent before it had left European waters. At Zara, a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos entered the picture. His father, Isaac II, had been overthrown and violently mutilated by his uncle, who now sat on the Byzantine throne as Alexios III. The young Alexios offered the Crusaders everything they could want: 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 Byzantine troops for the campaign, permanent naval support, and the subordination of the Greek Orthodox Church to Rome. All they had to do was restore him to the throne in Constantinople. The Doge drove the deal. Dandolo had served as an ambassador to Constantinople earlier in his career, had been expelled in circumstances that left him permanently hostile to the city, and had spent decades watching Venice's trade interests undercut by Byzantine rivals. As whether he was blinded by the Byzantines, as legend held, or simply saw an opportunity to destroy a commercial competitor under the cover of holy war, is a question historians still argue about. The answer is probably both. He understood that the promises Alexios was making were almost certainly false. No Byzantine emperor could raise those sums or deliver those concessions, and he supported the plan anyway. Constantinople was the greatest city in the world, the richest market in the eastern Mediterranean, and a fleet with French crusaders at its back had a reasonable chance of taking it. The Crusaders arrived outside Constantinople in the summer of 1203 AD. Alexios III fled. Isaac II and his son were restored. The young Alexios was crowned Alexios IV alongside his father. And then, exactly as Dandolo had probably predicted, the new emperor found he could not pay. He melted church plate, stripped icons of gold, imposed crushing taxes on the citizens of Constantinople, people who had no particular enthusiasm for Latin Christians in the first place, and who now watched their emperor impoverishing them to pay a crusader debt they had not incurred. In January 1204 AD, a popular uprising overthrew Alexios IV, who was summarily executed in his cell. His father Isaac died in captivity. A new emperor, Alexios V, came to power and told the Crusaders to leave. The Crusaders owed their money and now owed their promised justification for being there, besieged Constantinople. On the 12th of April, 1204 AD, a strong north wind helped Venetian ships come close enough to the Golden Horn fortifications for attackers to seize towers along the wall. The Crusaders poured through holes knocked in the stonework. By evening, the city had fallen. What followed across 3 days of sack has been described by both the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, who lived through it, and by Western participants who were apparently surprised by their own behavior. Churches were stripped. The Hagia Sophia was desecrated. Ancient bronze statues that had stood since the Roman Empire were melted down. Centuries of accumulated art, scholarship, and holy objects were looted, burned, or scattered to the winds. The scholar Sir Stephen Runciman called it, without evident exaggeration, the greatest crime against humanity committed in the Middle Ages. Innocent. The Third's response to the sack was moral fury, followed by political accommodation. He condemned the Crusaders' actions in terms that left no doubt about his view of what had happened. He also accepted the outcome. A Latin emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, was installed in Constantinople. A Latin patriarch replaced the Greek one. The Byzantine Empire was partitioned between Venice and the Crusades' leaders. Innocent's stated goal, reuniting the Eastern and Western churches, had technically been achieved at sword point. From the perspective of every Christian in the Greek world, a wound had been opened that would never fully heal. When the Ottoman Empire finally conquered Constantinople in 1453 AD, it conquered a city that had been permanently weakened by Christian hands 2.5 centuries earlier. The Fourth Crusade was the most spectacular example of the crusading instrument going wrong. But it was not the most intellectually disturbing. That distinction belongs to the Albigensian Crusade, launched by the same Innocent III in 1209 AD. Not against Muslims, not against pagans, not against the enemies of Jerusalem, but against the Cathars of southern France. The Cathars were Christians, or at least they called themselves Christians. They held dualist beliefs: 2 gods, 1 good and 1 evil. The material world the creation of the evil one, that the Catholic Church considered heretical. They were concentrated in the Languedoc, the wealthy, culturally distinct region of southern France, where their beliefs had found broad social acceptance among the nobility and the common people alike. Innocent had spent a decade trying to suppress the Cathars through preaching, negotiation, and local ecclesiastical pressure, and none of it worked. In 1208 AD, his papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was assassinated, almost certainly by a servant of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, the most powerful lord in the Languedoc, who was tired of being pressured to crush a religious community his own society had integrated. Innocent declared the legate a martyr, excommunicated Raymond, and announced a crusade. He offered the lands of the Cathars to any French nobleman willing to fight. The lands of southern France, some of the most fertile and commercially advanced in Western Europe, were suddenly available for conquest under the seal of holy war. The army that assembled at Lyon in June 1209 AD was enormous by any measure. Northern French nobility and their knights, motivated by a combination of genuine religious conviction, the standard indulgence offer, and 40 days of service in exchange for full legal claim to whatever they could take. It marched south toward the city of Béziers. On the 22nd of July, 1209 AD, the Crusaders besieged the city. When asked how to distinguish the Cathar heretics from the Catholic inhabitants, since both groups lived inside the same walls, the papal legate Arnaud Amaury reportedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Almost the entire population of Béziers was massacred. Estimates range from 10 to 20,000 people, Catholics and Cathars alike. The Albigensian Crusade ran from 1209 AD to 1229 AD. It accomplished 2 things. It did not, as it turned out, eliminate Catharism. The Cathars went underground, continued practicing in private, and required the subsequent establishment of the Inquisition to finish the job over the following century. What it did accomplish, with great thoroughness, was the political annexation of the Languedoc by the French crown. The distinct culture of southern France, Its language, its legal traditions, its remarkable flowering of troubadour poetry and relatively tolerant civic life was crushed under the weight of northern conquest. The Crusades' real beneficiary was the King of France. The Crusades' real victims were ordinary men and women in a distinctive regional culture that posed no military threat to anyone. Between Constantinople in 1204 AD and the Albigensian countryside in 1209 AD, the same papacy, under the same pope, had used the crusading instrument to sack the greatest Christian city in the world and to massacre Christians in southern France. Innocent III was not a hypocrite in the simple sense. He genuinely believed both actions were justified by the logic of his office and the needs of the Church. That is precisely what makes the two episodes so revealing. The crusading idea had been designed to serve the interests of Christendom as the papacy defined them. When the interests of Christendom, as the papacy defined them, turned out to require attacking Christians, well, the instrument was available, the precedent had been set, and the logic, once started, was very difficult to stop. By the early 13th century, the gap between what crusading promised and what it delivered had become impossible to ignore. The First Crusade had taken Jerusalem, and every subsequent expedition had either failed outright, achieved something far less than it intended, or, in the case of the Fourth Crusade, actively made things worse. Yet the institutional machinery of crusading, the papal call, the indulgence, the vow, the cross sewn onto a tunic, continued to function because the papacy's authority to call holy war had become one of the central pillars of its power, and retracting the instrument would have required retracting the claim. So the Crusades continued, their ambitions narrowing with each generation even as the rhetoric remained as large as ever. The Children's Crusade of 1212 AD is perhaps the strangest episode in the entire crusading era, and historians are still arguing about what actually happened. The traditional account, armies of children marching to the Mediterranean, yet expecting the sea to part before them, is almost certainly wrong in its details. What appears to have happened is something more mundane and no less sad. Two separate popular movements arose simultaneously in France and Germany, led by young men named Stephen of Cloyes and Nicholas of Cologne, drawing not armies of literal children, but crowds of the poor, the dispossessed, and the wandering, the same social class that had followed Peter the Hermit a century earlier. The Latin word used in contemporary chronicles, pueri, meant roughly poor young men, not children specifically. Most of them never reached the sea. Those who did found no ships waiting, no miracles forthcoming, and no plan beyond the conviction that God would provide. Some were reportedly sold into slavery in North Africa. Most simply dispersed, hungry and disillusioned, walked home. The Children's Crusade was never sanctioned by the papacy, but its existence tells us something important about the state of crusading in 1212 AD. The popular conviction that Jerusalem needed to be recovered was still powerful enough to move thousands of people out of their homes and onto the road with no resources and no plan. What had eroded was the confidence that the conventional instruments, armies, knights, papal organization, were the right tools for the job. Pope Innocent III reportedly said of the young crusaders that these children put the adults to shame, rushing to recover the Holy Land while the knights slept. He also, more practically, told them to go home. The Fifth Crusade of 1217, AD to 1221 AD, was the most thoroughly planned crusade since the first, and it failed in a way that encapsulates every structural weakness the movement had developed over the preceding century. Pope Innocent III designed it at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 AD with meticulous care. Specified targets, specified timelines, a dedicated system of church taxation to fund it, and the explicit promise that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II would lead the main force. Frederick took the cross. Frederick also did not come. He had reasons. He always had reasons. His absence hung over the Fifth Crusade like a bad weather forecast that never quite arrived. The crusade proceeded anyway, targeting Egypt on the now accepted strategic logic that the key to Jerusalem lay in Cairo. The army captured Damietta in November 1219 AD after a brutal 16-month siege. It was a significant victory. And then it sat. And the cardinal legate Pelagius, who had emerged as the Crusade's effective leader, twice refused generous peace offers from the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, offers that included the restoration of Jerusalem itself in exchange for the Crusaders leaving Egypt. The Italian merchant cities opposed the deal because they had commercial ambitions in Egypt. The Templars and Hospitallers opposed it for their own institutional reasons. Everyone waited for Frederick. In July 1221 AD, with Frederick still absent and provisions running short, Pelagius ordered an advance on Cairo. The army marched into the Nile Delta at the height of summer, was cut off by the annual Nile flood, and surrendered. They returned Damietta. They went home. They had held Jerusalem's key in their hands and declined to use it. The Sixth Crusade of 1228 AD to 1229 AD produced the most extraordinary outcome in the entire history of the crusading movement, and it was universally condemned when it happened. Frederick II had been promising to crusade for over a decade. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him in 1227 AD for yet another delay. Frederick, excommunicated, sailed anyway in 1228 AD. He arrived in Acre as a man condemned by the church, which meant the Crusader clergy refused to cooperate with him. The military orders were openly hostile, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem placed the city under interdict when he entered it. He was, in terms of formal church standing, a heretic leading a crusade. Frederick spoke Arabic. He had grown up in Sicily among Muslim scholars and administrators, maintained a court that was the most intellectually cosmopolitan in Europe, and corresponded on matters of philosophy and mathematics with Islamic thinkers as a matter of personal interest. He understood al-Kamil, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a political counterpart to be negotiated with. Al-Kamil had his own problems: rebellious relatives, a fractious empire, the distant threat of the Mongols. And Jerusalem was not a strategically significant city. It had no real fortifications, generated no substantial revenue, and was a permanent symbolic irritant that kept European crusades arriving in the region every generation. Al-Kamil calculated that the symbolic cost of giving it away was lower than the strategic cost of keeping it. In February 1229 AD, Frederick and Al-Kamil concluded a treaty. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were returned to Christian control for 10 years. The Temple Mount, containing the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, remained under Muslim administration. Muslim pilgrims retained full access. There was no battle, no siege, no massacre. Frederick entered Jerusalem in March 1229 AD, and in the absence of any clergy willing to perform the ceremony, crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The reaction from both sides was almost unanimously hostile. Muslim scholars condemned al-Kamil for surrendering Islam's third holiest city. The papacy condemned Frederick for recovering it through negotiation with an infidel rather than through holy war. The Patriarch of Jerusalem threw refuse from the windows as Frederick's procession passed through the streets. The logic of both condemnations is worth sitting with. Frederick had achieved, without bloodshed, what 6 previous crusades had failed to achieve with enormous bloodshed. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. Christian pilgrims could freely visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the response of the institutional church was fury, because the instrument of holy war had not been used, the indulgence had not been earned, and the ideological framework that justified both had been bypassed entirely. The crusade had been designed to recover Jerusalem. When Jerusalem was recovered, the people who ran the Crusades were angry about how it had been done. That tells you something essential about what the Crusades had become by the 13th century. The treaty lasted 10 years as agreed and then expired in 1239 AD. Jerusalem reverted briefly to Muslim control, was recovered diplomatically again, said and was finally and permanently lost in 1244 AD when a Turkic people called the Khwarezmians, displaced by the Mongol advance from the east, swept through the city and destroyed it so thoroughly that it never again functioned as a viable settlement under the remnant Crusader state. Louis IX of France launched 2 crusades in response. The 7th in 1248 AD, which ended in his capture in Egypt, and the 8th in 1270 AD, which he did not survive, dying of disease outside Tunis before ever reaching the Holy Land. Both campaigns were impeccably organized, personally led by the most pious king in Christendom, and achieved nothing beyond Louis's canonization as a saint. The Seventh Crusade in particular demonstrated how completely the strategic calculus had inverted since the first. Louis sailed with a well-equipped army to Egypt, but captured Damietta again in June 1249 AD and marched on Cairo. At Mansoura in February 1250 AD, his army was ambushed in the streets of the town during what appeared to be a successful advance, surrounded and destroyed. Louis himself was captured. The ransom paid for his release, 400,000 livres of gold, was roughly equivalent to 6 times the annual revenue of the French crown. The Egyptians had already been paid half by the time Louis left captivity. He spent 4 more years in the Crusader states, fortifying what remained of the coast before returning to France in 1254 AD. He left behind a realm that had been purchasing its continued existence through financial arrangement more than military power for decades. By the second half of the 13th century, the crusading movement had not died. It would persist in various forms for centuries, but it had changed its character almost entirely. The great sovereign expeditions that had defined the 12th century were gone. What remained were smaller, more targeted operations, baronial crusades, the crusades of the military orders in the Baltic, the private enterprises of individual lords seeking indulgence on a budget. The papacy continued to preach and tax and organize, but the European public had absorbed 150 years of crusade propaganda, crusade failure, and crusade taxation, and the reservoir of genuine enthusiasm had fallen to a level where no amount of preaching could reliably refill it. The institution had not collapsed. It had simply exhausted itself against a problem it could not solve. What the later Crusades reveal, taken together, is a movement caught between its own logic and its own limits. The logic said, Jerusalem is Christian. Its loss is a wound in the body of Christendom. God wills its recovery, and any sacrifice in that cause is sanctified. The limits said, the distances are enormous, the costs are unsustainable, the internal politics of the Crusader states are dysfunctional. The Islamic world is cohesive in ways it was not in 1099 AD, and the tool that worked once under extraordinary circumstances does not reliably work under ordinary ones. The institution refused to accept the limits. The limits accepted the institution anyway. What came next was not a new crusade, but the slow, grinding end of the world the Crusades had built. The city of Acre, in the spring of 1291 AD, was the last substantial thing the Crusader states had left. Jerusalem had been lost since 1244 AD. Antioch had fallen in 1268 AD, Tripoli in 1289 AD. What remained was Acre, a magnificent walled port city on the Levantine coast built on a narrow peninsula with the sea on 3 sides and massive double walls on the 4th, the commercial capital of what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the headquarters of every military order still operating in the region. The Templars had their fortress there. The Hospitallers had their compound. The Teutonic Knights had theirs, a gift from Frederick II decades earlier. Acre was also one of the busiest trading ports in the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan merchant quarters filled its streets, and a dozen languages were spoken in its markets. It was still, right up to the moment of its fall, a living city. The Mamluks who came to take it were a different kind of enemy from anything the Crusaders had faced in the 12th century. They were slave soldiers by origin, men purchased as boys from the steppes in Central Asia, trained in military disciplines from childhood, converted to Islam, and formed into a warrior caste that had overthrown their Ayyubid masters in 1250 AD and established their own sultanate in Egypt. Under Sultan Baybars, who ruled from 1260 AD to 1277 AD, the Mamluks had spent 2 decades systematically dismantling the Crusader states fortress by fortress, city by city, applying a campaign of methodical destruction that left nothing behind them capable of being reoccupied. When Baybars took a castle, he demolished its walls. He was not trying to acquire territory for himself. He was trying to ensure that no future crusade could use it as a base. By the time Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil turned his attention to Acre in the autumn of 1290 AD, he had a convenient pretext. A group of Italian crusaders, freshly arrived in the city as reinforcements, had attacked Muslim merchants in the market, killing a number of them. The Mamluk diplomatic delegation sent to demand the perpetrators be handed over was imprisoned. Khalil began assembling his army that winter. Giant trees were cut from the mountains of Lebanon and hauled to Damascus to be fashioned into catapults. Siege engineers were summoned from Aleppo. Contingents were requisitioned from Damascus, Hama, Tripoli, and Al-Karak. The preaching in the mosques fired volunteers in their thousands. By the time the army arrived beneath Acre's walls on the 6th of April, 1291 AD, it outnumbered the defenders by at least 3-1, and it brought with it siege engines on a scale the Crusader garrison had never seen. 2 of the largest catapults had been given names, Furious and Victorious. Inside Acre, the defenders understood what was coming. The Templar Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu had been warning for years that the city would eventually come under this kind of assault, and had sent increasingly desperate appeals to Europe for a new crusade to save what remained. The Pope issued a general encyclical. A few knights came. A small force from Cyprus arrived under Henry II's brother. The major contingent of Genoese merchants concluded a separate treaty with Khalil and departed. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Order resigned his post and sailed home to Europe. The city braced itself with what it had, roughly 15,000 defenders against a Mamluk army that contemporary estimates put at 45,000 or more, the largest force Islam had assembled against the Crusaders in 2 centuries. The siege lasted 6 weeks. The Mamluks worked continuously, day and night, their engineers pushing forward sapping operations under the walls, while the great catapults threw an uninterrupted stream of stone and Greek fire over the battlements. The defenders launched counterattacks and night raids on the Mamluk camps, burning siege engines and killing engineers, buying time they had no way to use. One night, sortie ended when a knight stumbled over the ropes of a Mamluk tent in the darkness, alerting the camp, and 18 crusaders died in the confused fighting that followed, including one who fell into a latrine trench. They were acts of courage in the service of a cause that had already been decided. The outer wall began to crumble by early May. On the 18th of May, 1291 AD, the Mamluks launched their final assault at dawn, heralded by the thunderous sound of hundreds of war drums carried on the backs of camels, a noise designed and apparently succeeding to produce terror in the men behind the walls. The accursed tower, a key point in the outer defenses, was overwhelmed in the first rush. Guillaume de Beaujeu led the Templars in a countercharge to retake it and was struck by a javelin under the armpit between his arm and his chainmail. His men, thinking he was retreating, called after him to stand firm. He reportedly turned and told them he could do no more. He was wounded to the death. He died later that day. His body was never recovered. The city fell in hours. The civilian population streamed toward the harbor in a desperate rush for the boats. Ships overloaded with refugees capsized in the harbor. William of Beaujeu's successor as Templar commander, Peter de Sèvres, attempted to organize an evacuation while holding the Templar compound on the seafront. He was killed at the gates while escorting women and children to the ships. The Hospitaller Grand Master, Jean de Villiers, was carried wounded to a Venetian galley and survived. The narrow streets ran with the chaos of a city falling simultaneously from multiple directions, and the Mamluk forces that had broken through the walls spread through the city without meeting organized resistance. By evening, Acre was theirs. The Templar fortress on the harbor held for another 10 days, a last redoubt where a small garrison barricaded themselves and refused to surrender. On the 28th of May, 1291 AD, Khalil sent envoys under terms of safe conduct to negotiate. The Templars admitted them. The soldiers accompanying the envoys began attacking the vulnerable refugees sheltered inside the fortress. The Templars killed the envoys and barred the gates. Khalil ordered the fortress undermined. On the 4th of June, the walls collapsed. The Templars who survived the collapse were captured. There were almost none. Khalil demolished the Templar fortress, then the rest of the city's fortifications, then much of the city itself, another site that no future crusade could use as a foothold. The Crusader presence on the mainland of the Levant was over. What happened next is worth pausing on. Now, the news reached Europe within weeks and produced immediate talk of a new crusade to recover what had been lost. Pope Nicholas IV wrote urgent letters to every king in Christendom. Plans were drawn up, committees were convened, treatises were written about the best strategic approach to a sixth crusade. None of it materialized. The kings of Europe had wars of their own, debts of their own, and a slowly forming sense that the crusading enterprise in the Levant was not a problem that could be solved by the kind of armies that had been tried. The proposals continued for another generation, increasingly theoretical, increasingly untethered from anything that was actually going to happen. For the people of the Islamic world, the fall of Acre in 1291 AD did not produce the triumphant celebration one might expect. As contemporary Muslim sources record the event with satisfaction, but without great elaboration. Acre was the end of a long process of recovery that had begun at Edessa in 1144 AD, and by 1291 AD, the conclusion had been visible for decades. The Crusader states had been dying by degrees since Hattin. What Acre represented was less a triumph than a completion. Khalil demolished the city and moved on. The Mamluks had other concerns: the Mongols to the northeast, internal politics in Cairo, the steady management of an empire. The Crusaders had occupied a century and a half of Islamic political attention. Their departure, in the end, was absorbed relatively quickly. The surviving Crusader institutions did not die immediately. The military orders regrouped on Cyprus, and the Hospitallers eventually conquered the island of Rhodes in 1309 AD and held it for 2 centuries, becoming a Mediterranean naval power in their own right. The Templars returned to France and were dissolved by a French king and a compliant pope in 1307 AD to 1312 AD, their wealth confiscated, their leadership brutally executed, their order destroyed by a European ruler who owed them money and found the heresy charge a convenient instrument. The Crusader idea itself persisted. In Spain, where the Reconquista was still in progress, in the Baltic, where pagan peoples were being brought under Christian rule by the Teutonic Knights, and in the recurring proposals for a new crusade to the east that circulated in European courts well into the 15th century. But the Jerusalem Crusades were finished, and on both sides of the experience, a reckoning was beginning about what they had meant. In Europe, the reaction was complex: grief, analysis, proposals for reform, a search for someone to blame. In the Islamic world, a memory was hardening into something that would outlast the events themselves by centuries. Acre had not simply been a military victory. It had been the culmination of a story about resistance and recovery, and the ultimate expulsion of an intrusion that had never been fully accepted as legitimate. That story, as it turned out, was only beginning to be told. Ask who won the Crusades, and you get an answer that depends almost entirely on when you stop the clock. If you stop it in 1099 AD, the Crusaders won. They took Jerusalem against extraordinary odds and established a Christian presence in the Holy Land that lasted nearly 2 centuries. And if you stop it in 1291 AD, the Muslims won. Every inch of Crusader-held territory on the Levantine mainland was back under Islamic control, and the Crusader states were gone. But neither date captures the actual consequences, which ran in all directions simultaneously, produced results nobody had planned for, and are still generating disputes about what they mean. The most immediate loser was the Byzantine Empire. This was not what anyone had intended. Urban II had conceived the First Crusade partly as a gesture of Christian solidarity toward the Eastern Emperor, and partly as a mechanism for healing the schism between Rome and Constantinople that had split the Church in 1054 AD. What the Crusades actually produced over the following century was a progressive deterioration of Byzantine-Western relations, a series of violent incidents in which Crusader armies looted Byzantine territory, and finally, in 1204 AD, the sack and partition of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade. The Byzantine Empire survived in successor states, recovered Constantinople in 1261 AD, and limped on for another 2 centuries. But it never regained its economic strength, its territorial extent, or its capacity for military self-defense. When the Ottoman Turks besieged Constantinople in 1453 AD, they besieged a city that had been permanently weakened by Christian hands 2.5 centuries before. For the Islamic world, the consequences were more complex than either victory or defeat. The Crusader presence had, counterintuitively, produced a long-term political integration that Islam had not previously managed. The need to resist the Franks had gradually forced the fragmented principalities of Syria and Egypt toward coordination, and the dynasty that achieved that coordination, the Ayyubids under Saladin, and later the Mamluks who replaced them, created a more unified political structure in the Levant than had existed before the Crusaders arrived. The Mamluks who expelled the Crusaders from Acre in 1291 AD were, in a direct genealogical sense, the political children of the military reorganization that the Crusader presence had made necessary. For Egypt in particular, the crusading era marked a sustained period of productive economic activity. The trade that flowed through the ports of Acre and Tyre connected Egypt and Syria to the commercial networks of the Italian city-states. And the volume of that trade grew rather than shrank during the crusading centuries. Muslim merchants traded with Frankish merchants in markets that operated under relatively consistent rules. The disruption of that trade network by the Mamluk conquest of the coast was, economically, a net loss for the region. One of the quieter ironies of the Crusades' end. The intellectual consequences of the crusading encounter are among the most significant and the least discussed. The Islamic world in the 12th and 13th centuries was the most advanced center of learning in the known world, not as a matter of cultural pride, but as a simple description of where the libraries, the universities, the mathematicians, the physicians, and the astronomers were concentrated. Contact with that world, however violent and intermittent, moved knowledge westward. Arabic numerals, the ones you are using right now, entered European mathematical practice through the commercial networks that the Crusades both exploited and expanded. Algebra arrived with them. Advanced medicine, astronomy, and philosophy followed through translations made in Sicily and Spain as much as in the Crusader states themselves, but the Crusades created conditions in which those translations were urgently desired. The commercial consequences for Europe were substantial and transformative. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew into the dominant commercial powers of the Mediterranean, partly because the Crusades gave them a captive market. Armies needed transport, supply, and trade. And partly because the Eastern connections they cemented during the crusading centuries created trade networks that outlasted the Crusader states by generations. The Italian city-states financed the Renaissance partly on wealth accumulated through Eastern trade routes that the Crusades had opened and secured. The luxury goods that came back with returning Crusaders, spices, sugar, silk, cotton, glassware, perfume, created new tastes and new demands in European markets that persisted long after the last Crusader fort fell. For the papacy, the consequences were deeply ambiguous. The Crusades had enormously increased papal prestige in the short term. Urban II had demonstrated that the Pope could mobilize the military resources of an entire civilization under his authority. But each subsequent crusade that failed, each scandal like the sack of Constantinople, each embarrassment like Frederick II's negotiated settlement, and each diversion of crusading energy against fellow Christians like the Albigensian Crusade, chipped away at the authority the institution had built. By the 14th century, the papacy's prestige had collapsed so far that the popes were living in Avignon under French influence. Their ability to command European obedience, a fraction of what Innocent III had exercised at his height. The crusading instrument had consumed a significant portion of the power it had been invented to serve. The consequences for the Jews of Europe were among the most catastrophic the Crusades produced and the least intentional. The Church's official position was that Jews should be protected, not persecuted. The Church did not always enforce this position effectively, and the popular religious excitement generated by Crusade preaching reliably produced anti-Jewish violence. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 AD were the first and worst episode, but each subsequent crusade generated its own incidents. Forced conversions, expulsions, burnings of synagogues, mob killings. The Crusades did not create European anti-Semitism, which had deeper roots, but they created repeated occasions for anti-Semitic violence on a scale that had not previously existed, established precedents for treating Jewish communities as legitimate targets of religious zeal, and contributed to a pattern of persecution that would continue and intensify long after the last crusade ended. What the Crusades did not produce is worth stating clearly. They did not produce a clash of civilizations that permanently divided Christianity and Islam into irreconcilable enemies. During the crusading era, the two worlds traded with each other, negotiated with each other, formed alliances with each other, and on countless individual occasions ate together, argued about medicine, and called each other friends. The simplification of that complex reality into a story of pure civilizational conflict is a later invention, a story that serves modern purposes rather than describing medieval facts. The hatred that exists in the 21st century between certain communities in the name of Crusade memory is built on a foundation of deliberate misremembering, and the people who built it knew what they were doing. The question of who won the Crusades may be less useful than the question of what they changed. They changed the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean. They changed the balance of commercial power in Europe. They transferred knowledge, technology, and material goods across a cultural boundary in both directions. They weakened the Byzantine Empire fatally. They contributed, however indirectly, to the intellectual conditions that made the Renaissance possible. They created institutional structures, the military orders, the Crusader legal codes, the papally directed war machine, that influenced European governance for centuries. They generated a set of precedents for holy war, the suppression of heresy, and the rights of papally sanctioned violence that outlasted the specific cause they had been invented to serve. And they left a memory in the Islamic world, in the Jewish world, in the Christian world, that was more durable and more politically potent than any territorial result they produced. The Crusades also produced Outremer, that brief, precarious, plural society on the Levantine coast where Frankish knights bathed and wore silk and argued theology with Syrian nobles. where trade flowed through markets that served Christians and Muslims alike, where the chronicles of Usama ibn Munkidh and Fulcher of Chartres described the same world from opposite directions and recognized, in spite of themselves, that it was worth describing. That experiment is easy to dismiss as a colonial imposition, and in its structure it was. But it was also a demonstration that sustained contact between civilizations produces things that neither civilization would have produced alone, and that the categories people go to war to defend are more permeable than the combatants on either side are generally prepared to admit. Saladin, asked near the end of his life what he had given away in charity, reportedly had his treasurer calculate the total. The answer was everything. He died with nothing in his treasury, and the cost of his funeral was borrowed. He had reunified the Islamic world, expelled the Crusaders from Jerusalem, negotiated with Richard the Lionheart, and then dispersed his possessions among the poor. Whether the story is precisely accurate is almost beside the point. The fact that both sides, Christian and Muslim, told it approvingly, tells us that a man who had spent his life fighting a holy war was remembered across the battle lines for his generosity rather than his victories. Something about the human experience of the Crusades resists the categories the Crusades were fought to defend. That something is worth more than the territory. The final accounting of the Crusades, if one were forced to make it, would run something like this. In the short term, the movement achieved its stated goal once, failed to maintain it, and spent 150 years failing to recover it. In the medium term, it produced a set of economic and intellectual consequences in Europe that were transformative and largely unintended. In the long term, it left a memorial in collective memory that has been systematically distorted for political purposes on every side. And it continues to generate heat rather than light in conversations about the relationship between the Western and Islamic worlds. The actual Crusades, the ones with the people in them, the specific decisions in specific places, and specific human encounters, were far more interesting and far less tidy than the memory. They almost always are. The Crusades ended in 1291 AD. The arguments about what they meant began almost immediately and have not stopped since. What is remarkable is not that the Crusades generated controversy. Events of that scale and duration always do, but that the popular memory of them has been shaped so comprehensively by forces that had nothing to do with the medieval reality, and that what most people think they know about the Crusades was constructed largely in the 19th and 20th centuries, and from materials that bore a selective and often deliberate relationship to the historical record. In the medieval Islamic world, the Crusades were not considered a defining catastrophe at the time. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers noted the Frankish presence, recorded the battles, and celebrated the victories at Hattin and Acre. But in the broader sweep of Islamic historical writing, the Crusaders were one threat among many, less consequential by most measures than the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 AD, which killed the last Abbasid caliph and ended the central institution of Sunni Islam in a single afternoon. The word the Arabic sources used for the Crusaders was not al-Salibian. Crusaders, that term, a loan translation from European historiography, did not enter common Arabic use until the 19th century, and the medieval Arabic term was al-Ifranj, the Franks, a geographical descriptor that placed them alongside the Normans and the Byzantines as Western peoples who sometimes came east and caused trouble. Saladin himself was largely forgotten in the Islamic world within a generation of his death. He was eclipsed by more successfully territorial rulers, Baybars of Egypt, who actually completed the expulsion of the Crusaders, commanded far more commemoration in medieval Arabic sources. Saladin's reputation as the great hero of Islamic resistance to the Crusades is, in significant measure, a Western invention. Sir Walter Scott's 1825 novel The Talisman portrayed him as a figure of chivalric nobility, the noble Muslim opponent who demonstrated Christian virtues better than many Christians. That image was absorbed into European Romantic historiography, and when Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany visited Saladin's tomb in Damascus in 1898 AD, he found a neglected mausoleum and left behind a wreath of bronze laurels. His visit helped spark a revival of interest in Saladin in the Arab world, an interest shaped by the Western image rather than the medieval one. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 AD was the first moment when Arab intellectuals began drawing explicit parallels between European military presence and the medieval Crusades. The comparison was available, memorable, and politically useful. It framed French imperialism not as a modern novelty, but as a repetition of a historical pattern, one that Islam had successfully resisted before and could resist again. By the end of the 19th century, as the European powers carved up the Ottoman Empire's territories and established colonial administrations across the Arab world, the analogy hardened into a framework. Arab nationalists described the Crusader states as the first European colonial experiment in the Middle East. The word colonial, al-Duwal al-Mustamira al-Ifranjiyya, appeared in Arabic to describe them for the first time in the 1890s. When France took Syria after the First World War and General Henri Gouraud entered Damascus in 1920 AD, he reportedly walked to Saladin's tomb and said, "Behold, Saladin, we have returned." Whether he said it precisely in those words is disputed. Whether it expressed what the French colonial administration believed about its own role is not. The British, occupying Palestine and Iraq, this encountered a similar framing from local resistance movements. The Punch magazine in London published a cartoon showing Richard the Lionheart watching the British Army enter Jerusalem in 1917 AD with the caption, "At last, my dream come true." Both sides were using the medieval Crusades as a mirror in which to read the present, and neither side was particularly interested in the medieval reality getting in the way. In Western Europe, the Crusades had gone through their own cycles of reinvention. In the early modern period, they were largely an embarrassment. The Protestant Reformation was not sympathetic to the papacy's most ambitious military enterprise. But by the 19th century, European Romanticism had rehabilitated the crusading knight as a figure of noble purpose, Christian heroism, and martial virtue. Walter Scott's novels, Tennyson's poetry, and a vast cultural output of crusade-themed art and literature created a popular image of the Crusades as a heroic Christian enterprise, conducted for purely spiritual motives against a fanatical enemy. This image was embraced by European imperialists who found the parallel flattering and the precedent useful. The 20th century produced a sharp reversal in Western historiography. Stephen Runciman's 3-volume History of the Crusades, published between 1951 and 1954 AD, was a work of formidable scholarship and eloquent prose that concluded with a judgment that has been quoted ever since. The Crusades were a vast act of intolerance in the name of God, a recurring human disaster. Runciman's framework positioned the Crusaders as aggressors and the Islamic world as the more sophisticated, more civilized victim. It was a corrective to centuries of romantic glorification, and it introduced into popular Western consciousness a version of Crusade history that had its own political valences, one that was adopted enthusiastically by Arab nationalist writers who found, in a respected English historian, confirmation of their own political framework. The problem with both frameworks, the romantic heroic one and the Runciman civilizational crime one, is that neither of them is particularly interested in the medieval evidence. The romantic version ignores the theological and political complexity of crusade motivation, the commercial calculations, the atrocities, the Fourth Crusade, the Albigensian Crusade. The Runciman version ignores the plural society of Outremer, the degree to which the Crusader states were tolerated and sometimes welcomed by neighboring Muslim powers, the commercial integration of the two worlds, and the fundamental fact that in the medieval Islamic world itself, The Crusades were not experienced as an existential civilizational assault. Both versions are constructed for modern audiences with modern concerns, and neither is the history. The most consequential reinvention of Crusade memory in the late 20th century came from jihadist political movements. The Crusades had been largely absent from Islamist political thought before the 1950s. What changed was the confluence of Runciman's influential Western framework, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 AD, and the writings of ideologues like Sayyid Qutb, who wove the Crusade narrative into a broader account of a permanent Western assault on Islam that required permanent resistance. In this framework, the medieval Crusades were not a specific historical episode, but the first chapter of an ongoing story, continuous with European colonialism and the American military presence in the Middle East. The Crusaders never really left. They only changed their uniforms. This was effective propaganda precisely because it had enough historical scaffolding to seem plausible. The Western response to this framing, particularly after the attacks of the 11th of September 2001 AD, was to produce its own version of the same mistake. President George W. Bush's use of the word crusade in a speech days after the attacks was immediately withdrawn as diplomatically disastrous. But the underlying conceptual framework, a clash of civilizations, Islam versus the West, a conflict rooted in medieval religious difference, shaped Western policy and public discourse for years. Both sides were doing the same thing, selecting from the medieval record the elements that confirmed a prior conviction about the essential, unchanging character of the other, and discarding the evidence of the commercial partnerships, the diplomatic negotiations, the shared meals, and the friendships that the record also contains. What the historical Crusades were, and what the memory of the Crusades has become, are now so thoroughly separated that the gap itself requires explanation. The actual events, complex, messy, motivated by an unstable mixture of genuine piety, land hunger, political calculation, commercial interest, and sheer contingency, have been replaced on both sides by a cleaner story that serves present-day purposes. The Islamic world was not a unified civilization defending itself against Christian aggression. The Christian West was not a unified civilization prosecuting a holy war against Islam. Both propositions are demonstrably false. Both propositions are now widely believed. The history produced the events. The politics produced the memory. The most honest thing that can be said about the Crusades at the end of all the evidence is also the most uncomfortable. They were not a clash of civilizations, because the civilizations involved did not actually clash in the clean, total way that phrase implies. They traded, negotiated, fought, borrowed from each other, and sometimes preferred each other to members of their own communities. They produced in the space between them a world that was genuinely plural, and that the modern imagination, on both sides of the argument, has found very difficult to accommodate. The holy war was real. The simplicity of the sides was not. And of all the things the memory wars about the Crusades have cost us, the loss of that complexity is probably the most expensive. The story that most people carry about the Crusades, whichever version it is, was not handed down from the medieval past. It was constructed in the 19th and 20th centuries by people with specific political needs, from a selective reading of sources that contained far more variety and contradiction than any clean narrative can hold. And the medieval people who fought and traded and negotiated and ate together and occasionally called each other brother across the lines of faith deserve something more honest than that. So, for that matter, do we?